Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're able to hear me okay. Do feel free to pop in the comments if you're having any particular issues. I can see we've got a viewer logged on already. Great. Just going to wait 1 minute before we get going this afternoon, just to allow some other people to join. So that we can make sure that everyone gets the benefit of that experience. Just I've cheated a little bit. I'm not in my living room. I'm in the kids' playroom, which has been converted to Dad's bike room. Don't tell my wife that I call it that. But yeah, this is where I've been doing lots of my exercise during lockdown. So I thought it was a great place to do the lecture today. And as you can see in the background over here, some of you might be familiar with that platform, which is an online cycling platform called Zwift, which is it's like Mario Kart but on a bike, and you have to pedal. So we've got the bike in there, and it transfers you onto the screen. It's magic. I'd never really been into computer games when I was a kid, but that one's got me hooked, and it's really kept me going through lockdown. So whilst you're joining, it would be great to hear if any of your kind of experiences of exercise, keeping yourselves active during lockdown, and how that's gone for you. Any top tips? I'm sure there's some great ideas out there that you guys can share with us as well. Right, we'll make a start. So thanks very much for joining this afternoon. A topic that's close to my heart. As you can probably tell already, I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise at the university. I've been here for just coming up to 8 years. And my background prior to that was in teaching in schools, working in a secondary school as a PE teacher. So my interest around physical activity really stemmed from my own experiences when I was a child. And I had quite a positive experience. I was really encouraged by my parents, my teachers at school. My brother had a big influence on kind of my physical activity habits as well. So, you know, that for me set me on a path to seeing physical activity as part of my life that I wanted to keep going when I was an adult. Played a lot of team sports as a kid, so football, cricket, rugby at school. But then as I've progressed through adult life, continued with football up until my children came along, and then time gets a little bit tighter, and the body gets a little bit older. So I've kind of adapted some of my physical activity habits, and now take part in endurance sports mainly, so running and cycling. And that's something that I've really embraced for the last kind of 7 or 8 years as well. And so, you know, that's a really important part of my life. In terms of research, so I'm just started out on my professional doctorate in sport at the university, and I'm trying to make some better connections between positive experiences of physical activity and physical education in youth, and how that might track into getting more people to be physically active in their adulthood. And it's really interesting, coming up to just doing my first piece of work linked to that, and there's lots of interesting topics around that, and we're going to touch on some of those today. So I guess, you know, first question for you guys is, you know, where does physical activity fit for you? Where does it sit in your life? Where is it in terms of your priorities? And how much do you value physical activity as something that's going to help you to lead, hopefully, a healthier lifestyle? Now, we've known the benefits of physical activity for quite a long time. And one of the first studies around this was actually a really interesting study just after the Second World War in the 1950s, that looked at the difference between bus drivers and bus conductors, conducted by a gentleman called Jeremy Morris. And they looked at the coronary heart disease rates between those two populations. Now, these were two different jobs, but essentially the people that were doing these jobs came from very similar backgrounds. One of the jobs involved sitting down, driving the bus all day, and the other job involved running up and down the stairs, collecting tickets, I imagine. I'm not sure if it works quite like that anymore. But they did find that quite obviously that we would attribute now that the bus drivers had a much higher rate of coronary heart disease compared to the bus conductors, and the major difference was their physical activity levels. So that was one of the first early studies that kind of looked at that. And from then on, over the past kind of 50, 60, 70 years, more and more research linking physical activity to the health benefits that come from that. So similar studies actually with postal workers and postmen as well. But we have got a bit of a problem in terms of physical activity, certainly within Western societies and certainly within the UK. So we've got some issues with adults not meeting physical activity guidelines. So only about 6 out of 10 adults tend to meet the current physical activity guidelines, which we'll come on to in a second. And about half of all children don't meet those guidelines either. The World Health Organization have put out an action plan that by 2030, they're going to try and reduce physical inactivity in adults and adolescents by 15%. So that's quite an ambitious target. And if we think about our lifestyles these days, physical activity has largely been taken out of our lives. Exactly, the kind of stuff that we've been experiencing at the moment. But also, if we go way before COVID times, we've automated our lives to the extent where lots of things are quite easy. So, from washing our clothes to getting from A to B, we've got lots of options that make that very easy for us, and a lot easier for us to get away with not being physically active. Something which actually the pandemic is heightened for us as well. And the long-term effects of inactivity, sadly, are a range of cardiovascular diseases, cancers, diabetes, and ultimately early death, which is obviously very sad. And if physical activity were a pill or a medication, we would be giving it to everybody. So I think it's something that's really valuable to look at. As well. And actually, I think it was most recent figures, 1 in 6 UK deaths were attributed to a lack of physical activity. So there you go. That could be important for us to consider. Now, the guidelines around physical activity perhaps aren't as clear as some other health messages. So if we think about 5 a day, very simple, 5 pieces of fruit and vegetables every day. That's fairly easy for everybody to understand. And the messaging behind it has been pretty clear. The 2020 World Health Organization guidelines around physical activity that the UK is adopted have become clearer, but they're not always easy to interpret for the everyday person in the street. So I'm going to outline those for you now. It's just some of you might be interested in those. So as adults, we should be doing 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic physical activity, or a slightly shorter period, 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity across the week. Can be a combination of those. And if we're looking at the intensities, moderate intensity is basically kind of 5 or 6 out of 10 on a scale of your perceived exertion. And the vigorous stuff, moderate to vigorous, is probably more 7 and 8 and above to be able to get those higher levels of physical activity in there. We should also be doing some strengthening activities in two or more days of the week. And try and reduce our sedentary behavior. Now, there's been a change and an update from the guidelines that came out 10 years earlier. The guidelines that came out 10 years earlier said that activity had to last for 10 minutes for it to count as being physically active, to count towards your weekly targets. But now any activity counts in those minutes that you build up. For children, it's slightly different. And the World Health Organization guidelines actually do outline different populations. So there's further guidelines for people in elderly populations and for people with disabilities as well. So it's worth checking out if you want to get a little bit more detail. Widely available on the web. For children, it's a 60-minute per day average, okay, is what they're looking for, of moderate to vigorous physical activity, with some vigorous activity on 3 days a week. And if we think about the statistics that exist around youth physical inactivity and obesity levels that are rising in youth populations, we're not quite getting there with some of that. I think one of the key messages that comes out from this, and it's something that they're keen to highlight, is doing some activity is definitely better than nothing, and all activity counts. So it doesn't have to be formal sport or anything like that for it to count. We're just looking at activity that raises your heart rate, your breathing rate, and your calorie expenditure within those areas. Moving on to kind of the area that I specifically look at and I work in is around the health of young people and how we can work to get more young people moving. And one of the key areas that we look at in that is the Sport England Active Life Survey, which actually does a yearly survey of the kind of activities and the levels of activities of the children in our country. We've got a bit of a problem. Only half of the kids are meeting those physical activity guidelines that we said. And actually it gets worse. So we get a drop off kind of end of primary school, and we get a further drop off through the mid-teenage to late teenage years as well, which is potentially really concerning because obviously that's where they're establishing some of the habits that they might take into their adult lives. So something that we've got a bit of an issue with, and we probably need to look at how we do something about that. The other issue we've got is a major issue around childhood obesity. 1 in 6 reception children currently are classed as overweight or obese. That's through the National Children's Measuring Programme, and it gets worse. So by the time they leave primary school, it's about a third of young people that are overweight or obese, and reversing those trends is really difficult. So we've got a real issue where we need to be able to do something about those particular areas as well. If we look at particular populations as well, we've sadly got an issue which seems to affect girls slightly more than boys, which again is something which is concerning. And also we've got some issues around young people from poorer backgrounds in lower socioeconomic groups, and some of that can be down to access, as well as some of the issues earlier around motivation as well. So potentially, I've painted quite a dark picture to start off with. I'm sorry about that. We'll try and lighten it up as we go through, hopefully with some of your own stories of some of your own physical activity habits as well. So one of the key areas that I focus on is around physical education in schools, obviously with my experience and my background in that and my interest. In potentially, we've got a real opportunity with our physical education programs. Every child in the country takes part in PE. They should be having it 2 hours a week at least. If your child's not getting 2 hours a week in their school, then I suggest you pen a polite email to the head teacher, and you can link me in and blame that on me if you want, no problem. But it could be a really crucial vehicle for giving young people the skills and the motivation that they need to be able to carry on and be physically active in their own time when they're teenagers or young people, but also after they leave school as well. So important that they can carry on with those. And actually, it's been a frustration of mine. One of my favorite films is Back to the Future. With Marty and Doc, and I'm sure if I got in my DeLorean and I went back 25 years to when I was at school, and compared it to what happens in the schools now, is that some things are very slow to change, in that some of the practices and some of the research around PE tells us that it's perhaps not changed enough to reflect the interests of young people, and so there's potentially something there. In David Kirk, who's one of the eminent scholars around PE, he's suggested that PE could be in need of radical reform. And I guess think back to your own PE experiences, think back to those, some of them hopefully positive, but also think of them from the perspective of some of your peers. How did they find PE? How did your parents find PE if you're a little bit younger at school? And what impact did that have on their motivations to be physically active as they left it? But I'm a big fan of implementing change when it's needed. And if we think about the problems that we've got, doing the same thing over and over again, we're probably going to end up with the same results. It's almost, I think it was Einstein who said that was the definition of crazy, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So in order to get more kids engaged in physical activity and gaining some of the benefits that I've certainly gained from being physically active, we might need to implement some changes. And one of the areas that I look at in particular is around the design of the curriculum. And some of the work that I'm doing at the moment in particular is around the activities that young people engage in. And actually, if we look at some of the data from kind of Sport England participation and look at the stuff that 18 to 24-year-olds are participating in, it's not always reflective of the stuff that they're doing in PE. So it's not always competitive sports. It's a lot more kind of lifestyle and informal based activities. So some of the things that I've been working on with our students at the university are things like parkour, skateboarding, Zumba, cycling, even golf. What a great sport for lifelong physical activity. So we had a session with my level sixes on Monday, and we said, you might introduce young people to golf and they might not go and play it straight away, but it could be a sport that they could potentially pick up later because they've had those initial experiences of being exposed to it as a potential option there as well. Also a big rise in informal sport. So for sport that's not necessarily got that really big competitive focus that's in a league or a competition or playing for a formal team. It's more about rocking up with your mates at a local space. It could be a leisure centre, a park, and playing a casual game of football or casual game of basketball or a social game of badminton. In those elements that have a more informal and social focus could actually be an avenue that we could explore within PE as well. And we've touched upon lots of the areas around physical health, and that's really important. I don't want to move away from that because our physical health and looking after our physical being should be very high on our priorities. We only get one body. We need to make sure that we look after it as best as we can. And there are lots of benefits to being physically active in terms of our physical health. But when we also look at other elements of health, certainly that have come to the fore in the last year, and we look at our psychological health and our well-being there's certainly some elements that can be built upon through sport and physical activity. And the evidence shows us that being involved in physical activity has a positive impact on things like your confidence, your self-esteem, reduce stress and anxiety, which I know for lots of us at the moment is probably something that we've been battling with as well. And certainly jumping on there at the end of the day after teaching online for several hours, it certainly does help me to switch off and reduce those stress and anxiety levels as well. There's also a big social element to our physical activity and sport participation. Developing social skills in young people, so important. Ability to communicate, ability to work as part of a team, ability to lead, and also the ability to resolve conflict. So important. So important for those areas as well. So knocking onto that social element, when we're going about our physical activity, and I'll quite often do it when I'm on the bike here, I'll be on a call to some of my friends at the same time, so that we can almost try and recreate the element of the social. If we were riding out in the Cotswolds and having a chat and a catch up, that we can do that on the bike, and that's also very important. And I think that will certainly be one of my recommendations, that if you can incorporate a social element into your physical activity as well, then that could be something that could be really useful. Also, a large element that physical activity can have an impact on our cognitive function. So getting out for a walk in the morning before work can be something really useful that's going to increase your brain activity. And there's lots of research out there that looks at kind of the impact of physical activity on children's brain activity and concentration levels and stuff as well. I've had students that in the past have done their dissertation where they've gone to watch the lesson after PE to see what the kids are like after they've had that bout of exercise. And after an initial settling period, quite often their concentration is improved, and improvements in behavior for some as well. So that's that there. I've just seen we've got a question in from Alison on the chat there. Thanks very much, Alison, around that embarrassment factor. I think that's so important, and certainly is something that impacts lots of young people, and my plea to them would be to talk to your teachers. Student voice is something which is probably been undervalued in education for a long time, not just in PE. So I think being able to actually say to your teacher, look, I'm feeling a bit embarrassed, I'm not very good. Things that have been done in the past to help with things like that is things like PE kit. Can we get some student input into the design of PE kit so that they feel more comfortable in what they're wearing, rather than necessarily having to have something forced upon them as well. So I think, the first step there would be definitely in terms of talking to your teachers. And actually some of the some of the things that we've done around exercising at home actually help with some of that, because you can build some confidence in your physical self at home, so that hopefully then as you go into more public domains like the school, like the gym, which can be very intimidating places, that can be really important. And I think buddying up, so that social element as well, Alison, can be really important for that as well. I wanted to touch on coronavirus. Sorry, didn't really want to impact that, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think that's Boris's party line at the moment, isn't it? And the impact that that's had on our physical activity habits, because I've been doing a little bit of research looking at what elements of physical activity have been impacted by COVID. And actually, one of the things that's come up quite prominently is this reduction in incidental physical activity. So yeah, I know the gyms are closed, team sports are off the agenda. You can only meet up with one other person to exercise. So that's given us some barriers to contend with there. But things like walking from the car park to work, walking from the bus stop to work, whatever it might be, walking to school, we've obviously got that, moving equipment around, even, part of my job, I end up doing practical content quite a lot of the time, and I'm moving equipment around, doing some lifting, those kind of things. Manual work for lots of people is kind of suffered as well. So we've lost some of those opportunities. So whereas we may have been able to build up some movement in our day naturally through our activities at work, for people that have been asked to work at home, and they're kind of on laptops all the time, that's completely gone. So we need to come up with some strategies around that. There's been a big drive. There's a group on Twitter that have been using their normal commute time to do their physical exercise. So if it takes you 20 minutes to drive to work and you used to leave the house at 8:30, you've got that 8:30 to 8:50 block in the morning where, leave the laptop closed, go and do some exercise, whatever it might be, depending on the weather. Could be a nice brisk walk, or doing a home workout, or anything that fits for you. The one that I've particularly enjoyed is some very active vacuuming around the house. So get the iPod on, headphones on, put on some tunes that you like, and go for a little bit of a high intensity vacuuming session. I might take that to Dragon's Den. We did see some increases in some activities though. So during the first lockdown, which is where we've got most of the data from, and as you would have probably noticed yourselves from being out and about, a big increase in walking and cycling, and fitness activities at home. So team sports were down 25%, but those things, I remember going out for a walk around Cheltenham during the summer, and there were people everywhere. So there has been some opportunity for us to have a look at that. And you couldn't buy a bike for the first part of lockdown, because everyone was out ordering bikes to go out there. Hopefully they're still being used, would be the request there. So we've seen that PE with Joe. So Joe Wicks came along as the nation's PE teacher, and kind of tried to get all of the kids active with his PE sessions, half an hour a day, 5 days a week, reduced down to 3 days a week. I think in the second lockdown, I think Joe was getting a little bit tired. Bless him. And that was received with mixed messages. Certainly the general public in the media, obviously it kind of was really well received, that Joe Wicks was doing this, and he raised a lot of money for the NHS, and I think we've got to make sure that we praise him for that. But there was also a concern that it was pigeonholing PE as just being about fitness activities, and some of the colleagues at Loughborough wrote a fairly eminent piece around Joe Wicks being one small part of PE, rather than being the whole entitlement of what PE is, which is learning in, through, and about physical as well. So I think there was kind of a caveat with some of that, but fair play to him. And I know lots of kids did get some enjoyment and fun out of those initially, before maybe motivation started to wane a little bit. Other stuff, home yoga, home Zumba. I've got a student and a sister-in-law that run Zumba stuff online, and I know they're really popular as well. And I think clubs, lots of sports clubs were switching to online. So I know the hockey club that I coach for, we're sending out videos of little challenges for kids to do as well. So I think, you know, they can be really proud of some of their efforts in those kind of key areas as well. I guess just kind of closing off for today before we open up the floor to any questions was to think about how we can maybe get people to be a little bit more motivated than what they are. Some people have really done well at increasing their physical activity levels through lockdowns. Other people, it's been really difficult. And I guess my mantra around this is that you've got to find joy. You've got to find joy. You've got to find delight in some of the elements of physical activity. And I know that really works for me. And there's different levels of motivation, and we want more people in that top level that they're doing it because they absolutely love it, and it's really good fun. If they're on the next level down and they're doing it because they value the benefits, that's okay. And I guess what we need to do is get more people into those top two levels. But how do we get there? So how does something become really meaningful and special? Well, some of the work around this identified some key factors that could help for creating physical activity and physical education that's really meaningful to people. In the first bit we touched upon already was the social interaction element. So getting some friends to do it with you, or even one friend, can be really important to helping make that physical activity experience positive. The next one was around fun. So making sure that something's fun. You know, if you know that you hate something, don't go and make yourself do it. Try and find something that you think you can find a little bit of excitement and a little bit of fun in there as well. Another part is challenge. So lots of people like a challenge. So setting yourself a goal to be able to achieve. So whether that's to run a certain loop around your local area, or whether you feel like you need to enter an event. There's lots of virtual events that go on at the moment to be able to do that. So set yourself a challenge, set yourself a target. Links really well with kind of goal achievement theory, which is a theory of motivation around there as well. Competition, this is a bit of a Marmite topic. So for some people, competition is a real motivator and they like being competitive. And on the Zwift platform behind me, you can race. My God, I love it. It's brilliant. It's brutal, but it's brilliant. So that for me is a real motivator. But for some people, they don't like that. So if it doesn't work for you, don't put yourself in that competitive environment. The other bit is the idea of something that you can get better at. So that idea of feeling competent. So that's really important in terms of motivation, is being able to feel competent at something. So try and pick something that you think either you've got a little bit of an aptitude for, or you think that with a little bit of effort and a little bit of practice, you could get better at it. And I think that's really important as well. And you've got to avoid the what's the point question. So the last point is around something that's personally relevant. So, you know, something that you've got an interest in. You know, so many times we get kids that ask, what's the point in this, sir? Well, actually, you need to be able to articulate that. And if you can't articulate that, then you probably need to be doing something different as well. So social, fun, challenge, little bit of competition, maybe, a little bit of competence, and something that's relevant to you. Hopefully some of those tips will get you more active at home. Right, ladies and gents, we've kind of come to the end of our time slot. I'll hang around for a minute just in case there's any questions. Otherwise, thanks very much for joining, and good luck with your physical activity endeavours. Well, we've got some comments in here. Should have been scrolling down whilst I was doing it. Oh, Haley, sport and mental health. The one of the major things around mental health in sport is that social element is really important, but I'm a really big believer in the power of nature. And there's some pretty good research out there that tells us about green and blue spaces. So green spaces being the fields in the hills. We're fairly lucky around here. Blue spaces, water as well. And I think that there's some really good research that tells us that getting out into the natural world is really important. You know, sometimes I feel guilty that, you know, this is just more screen time, which I'm not sure is always good for me. And I'd love to be able to get out, but sometimes safety is that can be a bit of a concern. ease into it. The 10-minute rule, Listra. So the 10-minute rule. So, and this is from Paula Radcliffe. She's pretty elite. So she used to get out for runs, and sometimes she didn't feel like it. So she'd always say, go and do 10 minutes, see how you feel. If you don't feel great, head back. But normally within that first 10 minutes, you shake off some of the sluggishness. So start with short duration, start with kind of lower intensity, and that would be a great start for you there. Competitive sport for teenagers. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Strava is an app. It's a GPS tracking app. And what it does is it creates segments around the local area where you can run in set a time or cycle, and you can go out and you can try and beat your friends. So that can be a really good one for that. So I think, yeah, in terms of competitiveness, Strava segments. My cycling club in Cheltenham, actually, they set a golden segment each month to challenge people to go out. Just be careful if you go in super fast on some of those segments, though, from a safety point of view as well. Cool. Right. I think we're about there, ladies and gents. So thanks very much for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.